So what I have uncovered over the last couple days has the potential to absolutely upend the reality of the Epstein case as we know it. In order to understand the connections that I'm about to make, we all have to go back in time to this man, Scott Rothstein. For legal purposes, as always, this is all alleged and my own opinions. Now, in the 2000s, Scott Rothstein was a prominent Florida lawyer. When he started out his career, he was an employment and labor lawyer, eventually breaking off, starting his own firm known as RRA, and extended to a lot of different areas. The man was wildly successful and very politically connected. Here he is with the Governor Charlie Crist, who in 2008 will appoint Rothstein to a judicial nominating commission responsible for selecting judges, and you'll see why that's insane soon. But by 2009, he would be arrested in one of the biggest Ponzi schemes, accused of stealing $1.2 billion from his clients. So how did he get there? Rothstein built his business model on extortion and blackmail. He would go after high-profile defendants and essentially stalk them until he got dirt on them. Then after he would get a settlement from these people, he would use it to go get investors, telling them that he was representing victims in a sexual harassment or a whistleblower case and they needed cash immediately. He would then make fake bank websites, forge signatures of federal judges on fraudulent court orders, and then the investors would buy the rights to these confidential settlements. Now, on the surface, it seemed like a pretty standard Ponzi scheme that was being run here, but the more I dug into it, the more the warning lights were flashing in my face. When the recession hit from 2007 to 2009, Rothstein's investors suddenly disappeared. His investors were hounding him for returns. Nobody knows how Rothstein got onto the FBI's radar, but on November 3rd, 2009, they raided his office. The days leading up to the raid, he was sending messages to other lawyers that he knew asking what countries did not extradite to the US or Israel. A week before the raid, he sent $16 million to someone in Casablanca, Morocco, and he went on the run. Now, in between going on the run and when the FBI raided his office, he sent a self-unaliving note to a bunch of people. Personally, I don't think he sent that. I think that was a warning to him if he didn't come back to the United States, what would happen to him. Because on November 3rd, he came back to the US. They RICO charged his ass, and at first he pled not guilty. He quickly reversed that to a guilty plea. Obviously, he was denied bond, but in furtherance of his plea agreement, he was actually put into witness protection program while in prison. Even though he was clearly cooperating with the government, he still got a 50-year prison sentence. I could go more into this, but I'm just going to speed through it at this point. Basically, Rothstein was cooperating with the feds. He was trying to get his sentence reduced, but in 2011, he lied about something to them, so it was taken off the table. In 2018, he petitioned the courts to help reduce his sentences because he said the government wasn't upholding their end of the deal for his cooperation. However, it was a no-go. I know this is tedious, but I promise you we have to get through this in order to get to my point. Because Rothstein is going to be a hidden linchpin that's going to pull all of this together. The early days of Rothstein's career was very hard to track down, but I eventually found this, unfortunately hidden behind a paywall. Prior to 1993, Rothstein worked directly with Bill Lorach at the then called Milberg Weiss law firm. Bill Lorach was once a prominent civil attorney, most notably winning $7 billion in the Enron case. You know, the Enron case where Kathy Rumler was the lead prosecutor. Shortly after the Enron case, however, he pled guilty to obstruction of justice and was sentenced to 2 years of prison. Why? Because he admitted to running a kickback scheme where essentially he would go and court plaintiffs for civil lawsuits, and they would pay people to not only be the plaintiffs, but for people who recommended these plaintiffs. These schemes were not only hidden, but it was proven that the plaintiffs were lying under oath about receiving compensation for their roles in this. It seems to me that Rothstein took that business model and decided to sprinkle in some trafficking. Because in 2011, in a 10-day secret deposition, Rothstein admitted to keeping a condo across the street from his law firm for escorts. I think it's going to become very clear soon that the escorts were not actually escorts. He was spending $50,000 to $60,000 a month to keep these women across the street for him, his friends, and his business associates. When I went to go try and find this testimony here, oh, looks like it's been scrubbed. I wonder if it has something to do with the fact that the judge granted the government's motion to prohibit it from being videotaped, citing serious harm and security reasons that are unusual in nature. What? So the red flags were already in full effect for me when I found out that Rothstein actually adopted a son. Now this is where it's going to get real weird real quick, folks, because the orphan that he adopted was actually a client of his that he represented in a lawsuit when his father, Charles Blade Jr., was accidentally shot in the head by his cousin, Brian Blades, who was a linebacker on the Seahawks. Honestly, it did seem like it was an accident, but Brian Blades was charged and ultimately convicted of manslaughter. Weirdly enough, a judge would actually overturn overturned that guilty verdict, stating there was not enough evidence, even though he admits on the 911 call as he's crying that the gun accidentally went off and he shot his cousin in the head. And then weirdly enough, an appellate court backed the ruling. It should be noted that Brian Blades not only played for the Seahawks, but two of his brothers played for the Detroit Lions while his nephew played for the Redskins. So Scott Rothstein supposedly represents this 11-year-old child and other family members in the civil suit against this NFL football player, adopted him, and then gave him that money when he was 18. Now, I'm not buying it at all, because Blades would not even tell the reporter when he legally adopted him. But this whole story is just weird because Blades says that he did a good job raising me, yet Charles said that he never lived with Rothstein. It seems like this kid wasn't even a part of this lawsuit to start with, because there was also the mother, the sister, the ex-wife, two more kids. So it's really convenient that that manslaughter conviction was overturned, because now that he wasn't going to prison, he was now able to sign a $4.5 million 3-year contract with the Seahawks. Then Scott Rothstein got very invested in the Miami Dolphins Dan Marino's foundation. There were lots of parties he would take that little boy to, whose owner, Stephen Ross, is not only a real estate mega millionaire billionaire developer, but is directly related to doing business with the Deutsche Bank, as well as the University of Michigan, because he has a school named after him there, who had their own abusive Dr. Larry Nassar type scandal. And the university received blowback because they found out recently that Steptoe and Johnson was hired as their independent investigators into the allegations. And as we know, a bunch of those lawyers not only worked for Epstein, but Reed Weingarten was one of his besties. Now, I tell you all this just to show you how interconnected these worlds all are, because we're seeing a very clear pattern in very different ways all across different factions of this ring. Because when I heard that Rothstein actually adopted a little black boy, I immediately thought of the little black boy that Mike Johnson adopted. You know, the one he claimed to have saved by adopting him, but then actually never legally adopted him. The one he met through a Christian youth home at age 14 and seemingly abandoned him and sent him to Florida, where he went through a string of petty crimes and yet somehow stayed out of prison. I highly recommend you pause and read this one case of his. Kind of like how also Matt Gaetz adopted a brown boy, but not legally. A boy whose PayPal he used to send payments for those trafficking victims. A boy who's now in the Air Force stationed in Germany, like Lindsey Graham was, who also adopted his sister at 13 under weird circumstances. And guys, I haven't even gotten to the meat and potatoes of all this. I haven't gotten to the point of this video. This is all just necessary backstory for what I'm going to tell you in the next one. Because now that I've tied Epstein survivor lawyer Jack Scarola directly to Growing Together, the teen rehab center that Virginia Roberts was allegedly trafficked out of, she writes a whole chapter about it in her book, but never directly implicates them in it. Not only was Jack Scarola on the board of trustees for the entire iteration of Growing Together, but he fought legally in court to keep children from being released so that CPS could interview them out of the presence of the counselors. Not only did he represent the employees of Growing Together in several lawsuits, he was able to argue in court to keep the children locked up against their will, because before, children who didn't want to stay there could just leave through the front door. He's the guy who fought in court to make it legal for the staff to physically restrain the kids from leaving. Now, Bradley Edwards, the first lawyer to bring a lawsuit against Epstein, worked for Scott Rothstein from April of 2009 until November when he was arrested. But that's nothing new. In fact, Epstein and Bradley Edwards were suing each other back and forth for years, with Epstein just saying, well, Bradley Edwards is only doing this in order to further fund the Ponzi scheme. Bradley Edwards wasn't even working for Epstein during the first lawsuit. And Epstein's lawsuits against Scott Rothstein and Bradley Edwards were all eventually dropped or thrown out by the courts. Then I started digging hard into Bradley Edwards. What I have discovered about Bradley Edwards is going to change your perspective of everything. What if Epstein was right? Because survivors have started reaching out to me. And suddenly things that have never made sense before are falling into place and clicking. Because I know I've had questions that I've been afraid to ask, afraid to breathe a whisper of doubt. And if this video disappears on you, don't worry, I'm going to slice them all together and put it on my page on YT.